Imagine coming home after a long day, only to have your own driveway turned into a crime scene by a man claiming to protect your neighborhood. That's exactly what happened to FBI Tactical Commander Simone Kearns. And what unfolded next left an entire community stunned. The night was supposed to end. Quietly for Simone Kearns, she had just left a late strategy meeting at the FBI field office in Sacramento, her mind still running through the day's list of reports and follow-ups by the time she turned her SUV off the main road and into the gated neighborhood of Fairgrove Estates in Elk Grove, California. She was already planning tomorrow her 7 serum run, her daughter's school drop-off, and the briefing she had to lead by noon. Nothing in her schedule hinted at chaos, but sometimes trouble doesn't wait for an invitation. It parks itself right in front of you, Simone. Tap the clicker clipped to her visor and the iron gate swung open. She eased into the subdivision, passing rows of identical 2-story homes with manicured lawns and porch lights glowing. Her own townhouse sat near the back corner, lot with a maple tree that had been her favorite selling point when she bought the property. 3 breeds. Months earlier, as she slowed in front of her driveway, she noticed a figure already standing there. A man, arms crossed, feet planted wide as if he owned the concrete she'd paid for. Simone squinted. The glare from his high-visibility vest caught her headlights, but the gun on his hip was what made her. Muscles tighten. He wasn't law enforcement that much. She could tell immediately his stance was sloppy, too loose for a trained officer. She stopped the car, rolled the window, halfway down. "Evening," she said calmly, her voice even. "Can I help you?" The man stepped forward, planting himself in the middle of her driveway. He looked mid-50s, stocky build, hair shaved down to a salt and pepper buzz cut, his name stitched in bold letters on his vest. "Reed Douglas Brinton. You live here." His tone wasn't friendly. "It was a test." "Yes, I do," Simone answered. She reached for the garage remote, ready to prove her point but Douglas didn't move. Instead, he tapped his fingers on the grip of his holstered pistol. "This is private property, residence only." "You don't look familiar." Her jaw tightened, not in anger, but in focus. She'd faced men like him before, in far worse places. Hostage takers, paranoid suspects, cornered suspects, cornered traffickers. The difference was she'd never expected the same attitude to greet her just a few feet from her own front door. "I'm not a stranger. I'm your neighbor, Simone Kearns, Unit 314. She said. She kept her tone even, but her hand hovered near her purse, not for a weapon, but for her badge. If the moment demanded it. Douglas didn't back down. "Haven't seen you at the CHOE meetings," he said, his eyes narrowing. "And around here, we keep track." Simone exhaled slowly, letting the silence hang. The tension wasn't just between them anymore. Curtains twitched along the row of homes. Porch lights clicked on one. Juror of homes. Porch lights clicked on one. By one, she could feel eyes watching, judging, maybe even recording. "I'm coming home from work. I'd appreciate stepping aside so I can park my car," she replied. Douglas chuckled dryly. Then, without warning, unclipped his holster and pulled the gun. Halfway out, the metallic sound froze the night. "You're gonna rama." "Need more than words," he muttered. Her training kicked in, heartbeat, steady breathing. Measured, she didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction of fear. But she scanned his body language, the twitch in his left hand, the way he held his feet unevenly, the bravado covering uncertainty. Dangerous, yes, but undisciplined. Neighbors shifted behind windows, phones lifted discreetly. She heard a whisper float across the street. "He's got a gun on her." For a split second, Simone imagined how this looked from their perspective. A man with a pistol towering over a woman, trapped in her own driveway. One wrong move and the story could end in tragedy. She leaned slightly out the window. "Mr. Brinton, you're pointing a weapon at a resident. That's not only reckless, it's illegal. Lower it now." Douglas shook his head. "You don't belong here. People like you don't just slide into a place like this without you. A place like this without anyone noticing. I'm new HOA safety chair. It's my job to make sure this community stays safe." Safe, the word stung her with its irony. She had spent 2 decades teaching federal agents how to neutralize threats, protect civilians, and keep cities safe. Yet here she was being branded as danger by a neighbor, who saw only what he wanted to see. The standoff stretched seconds, feeling like minutes. Simone's fingers grazed the leather of her badge holder. She didn't want to reveal it yet. Not until she had him calm enough not to panic. But patience had limits, and Douglas was pushing them. Her eyes flicked to the curved legs. Houses again, more cameras, more whispers. She wasn't just defending herself. She was performing before an audience of neighbors who would repeat every detail tomorrow at work, at church, at the HOA potluck. But right now, None of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the barrel of a gun aimed into her direction, and the man behind it too blinded by suspicion to realize who he was threatening. But before she could decide whether to flash her badge or step out of the vehicle, Douglas took a step closer. Gun now fully drawn. The gun was out. Now no longer a suggestion, no longer a threat hovering on his hip. Douglas Brinton held it with both hands, aiming straight at Simone's car window. The street was dead, silent except for the faint rustle of leaves from the big oak tree on the corner. A single car rolled by on the cross street, slowed when its driver noticed, then quickly sped away. Simone knew she had seconds to ground the situation before it tipped. She rolled the window completely down and leaned slightly forward. "Careful not to make sudden moves, Mr. Brinton," she said slowly, her tone measured, calm but firm. "You're pointing a loaded gun at someone who lives here. Put it away. We can talk her way. We can talk her." Voice wasn't pleading. It carried the weight of command, the kind she'd used in hostage negotiations across hotel lobbies, parking garages, and apartment hallways. She was practiced in stripping panic from her words, but Douglas didn't lower the weapon. His jaw flexed, his voice sharp. "Don't try to play me. I've been watching this block every night for 3 years. I know who belongs, and I've never seen your face, not once." Simone's gaze locked on his hands. He wasn't steady. His trigger finger floated too close, shifting with every breath. He was a man playing soldier, convinced he was protecting his people. He was protecting his people, but he had no training to back up the posture that made him unpredictable and dangerous. She raised her voice just slightly, projecting so that the neighbors listening from their porches could hear too. "My name is Simone Kearns, Unit 314. I bought the townhouse 3 months ago. I live here. You can check the property records tomorrow if you'd like, but right now this needs to stop." Her calmness seemed to irritate him. His nostrils flared. "Don't lie to me," he barked. "You think you can just say a number and I'll believe it. You're not fooling anyone. I know who lives here, and you aren't one of them." From across the street, a woman's voice called out timidly, "Doug, maybe she does live here." Douglas snapped his head toward the voice, waving the gun slightly in that direction. "Stay inside, Sharon. I've got this under control." The motion made Simone's muscles tense, a weapon waving wildly in a residential blur. Street neighbors huddled behind curtains. It was a tragedy waiting to happen. She lowered her voice, steady, grounding the moment. "Douglas, I'm not your enemy. You don't need to aim that gun. You need to aim that gun. You need to put it back in the holster right now." He hesitated, chewing on her words, but pride held him. "You don't get to it. I'm the safety committee chair. I keep the crime out. I know what trouble looks like." Simone's lips pressed into a thin line. Trouble. She thought he was looking directly at the least threatening person on the block, an exhausted woman coming home from work and calling it danger. Her phone buzzed inside. Her bag, probably her daughter or maybe a colleague. She didn't move for it. Any quick reach could be mistaken instead. She kept her hands visible, resting them on the steering wheel. "You don't know me, Douglas," she said. "But I promise you, if you pull that trigger tonight, your entire life changes. You will too. Not walk away from it the way you think. Lower the gun. You're standing in front of cameras, in front of witnesses, in front of the law." His eyes flicked toward the houses again. Indeed, 2 phones were raised behind the fence across the street, little red lights blinking, the weight of being recorded. Pressed on him, but his ego fought back. "You're trespassing," he repeated, though softer now, as if trying to convince himself. Finally, Simone moved slowly, carefully. She opened her door and stepped out of the SUV. She kept both palms visible, raised slightly at shoulder height. "You want proof? I live here. My keys are in my hand. My garage clicker opens this door right here. Watch." She pressed the button, and with a heavy groan, the garage door began to lift. Gasps echoed from the porches. The motion light flicked on inside, washing the empty garage in pale yellow glow. Douglas flinched, lowering the barrel an inch. "That doesn't mean anything. You could have stolen that remote." "Don't think I don't know tricks." Her patience thinned. "You're escalating a situation that didn't need to exist." "Look at me, Douglas. I'm standing in my own driveway in front of my own garage. You're the one holding a gun. You're not You're not authorized to carry like this." His eyes narrowed, his grip still shaky. "I'm authorized enough. Hawi voted me to protect this street, and I don't take chances." Simone almost laughed, not from humor, but disbelief. "Protect." He was one twitch away from putting a bullet in a federal agent. "Douglas," she said, her voice dropping into a low, commanding tone, the kind she used with suspects moments before they broke. "You need to listen very carefully right now. You are holding a deadly weapon against an innocent resident. That's a felony. felony. Put the gun down or you will answer for it in ways you haven't imagined, the Tiltsen. Very quaint. The neighbors' whispers grew louder. A man across the street called out, "Doug, maybe back off, man." She just opened the garage, but Douglas's face reddened. He wasn't ready to let go of control, not in front of his audience. Pride welded his fingers around the grip. But the more she challenged his authority with Thaddeus' authority, with truth, the more his anger surged, and the standoff was only getting started. The standoff stretched on every second, feeling like a test of who would blink first. The porch lights across the street glared down. Like stage lamps casting Simone and Douglas in a scene that neither had rehearsed. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice, then went quiet again. As if sensing the tension, Simone kept her breathing steady, her eyes locked on the weapon. Douglas's arms wavered slightly, betraying fatigue, but he clenched his jaw, unwilling to drop the act of control. His voice sliced through the silence. "You're too calm. Nobody stands this still with a gun in their face unless they're hiding something." Simone tilted her head, her voice calm but edged with authority. "Or maybe I'm calm because I know panic won't save either of us. Think about that." The words landed. Douglas blinked, his grip faltering for a second before he pulled himself back. He wasn't expecting pushback delivered so evenly. He expected fear, trembling, pleading what he got. Instead was composure, and it rattled him. A young man with a phone whispered loudly from a nearby porch. "She's not even flinching. She must know what she's doing." Douglas whipped his head toward the voice, snarling, "Stay out of this, everyone inside." The gun followed his movement, swinging too close toward the house. Gasps echoed in the night. "Eyes on me." Douglas, Simone commanded firmly, snapping him back before disaster struck. "You're scattering that weapon all over the block. Do you realize how reckless that is? You could have just aimed at your own neighbor's child without knowing it for the first time." Douglas hesitated, his lips pressed together. No words immediately. Boots pressed together, no words immediately. Ready, he was a man used to barking orders at HO meetings, not being corrected by someone who knew the real language of authority. Simone's fingers brushed against the leather of her badge holder, again revealing it now. Could change everything, but she measured the risk. Flash it too soon, and he might panic, thinking she'd tricked him, thinking she had been mocking him all along, but wait too long, and he might slip further into rage. She decided to probe. "You keep saying you're the safety chair. Tell me, Douglas, what kind of training do you have? Who certified you to carry that weapon like this? Who referred her into rages of taught you how to de-escalate conflict?" Her words weren't just questions. They were scalpel cuts slicing into his false authority. "I don't need training." He shot back. "I've been in this neighborhood for 15 years. I know what kind of people don't belong. I don't need a degree to see through lies." Simone's jaw, Hadon's jaws. Falsetta, but she didn't rise to the bait. She knew what he was implying, and so did everyone watching. She let the silence hang heavy before she spoke. "You've lived here 15 years, and in all that time you've convinced yourself you're a one-man police force, but the truth is you're waving a gun in front of Funelation. Hence, families you claim to protect. Ask yourself what happens if your finger slips." His nostrils flared, his face crimson. "Don't turn this on me. You're the one sneaking into a place you don't belong." Finally, Simone let her voice sharpen, not loud, not panicked, just sharp enough to cut through his bluster. "Douglas, I belong here more than you realize. And the reason I'm calm is because this isn't the first time I've had a gun aimed at me, but I promise you, it's the first time the person holding it has been this unprepared." The murmurs from the neighbors swelled. One man muttered, "Unprepared? What does she mean by that?" A woman whispered. "She sounds like law enforcement." Douglas sneered, but his grip shifted again. Sweat slid down his temple. His bravado cracked slightly. Simone pressed forward, her voice unwavering. "If you fire that gun, it won't just be me. You'll have to answer. There are cameras, there are witnesses, and there's law that doesn't bend to Hoey votes." Her hand moved slowly to her purse. She spoke as she did it, giving him every signal so he wouldn't panic. "I'm going to show you something, Douglas. You'll want to see it before you make another mistake." His voice was Warsaws. Shaky now, but still defiant. "Don't try anything. I'll shoot if you make a move." Simone opened her bag carefully, pulling out the leather case, holding it flat in her palm, so every neighbor could see the gold badge gleamed under the streetlights, catching eyes before it caught his "I'm Special Agent, Steve Agent Simone Kearns, FBI Tactical Command Unit, Sacramento Field Office. I live here. You are pointing a weapon at a federal officer and a neighbor, and you are one breath away from destroying your own life." Gasps broke out across the porch as phones zoomed in. The silence cracked into sharp whispers. "She's FBI. Oh, my God. He pointed a gun at an agent. Douglas froze, staring at the badge as if it had slapped him. His mouth opened, then closed. His grip loosened slightly. Though the barrel still wavered in Simone's direction. "You're lying," he muttered weakly, but the conviction in his voice was gone. His audience had shifted. They weren't seeing him as the protector anymore. They were seeing him as the aggressor who had just aimed a gun at one of the highest trained law enforcement officials in the country. Simone didn't move closer. She didn't need to. The badge did the talking now, but instead of backing down, Douglas's pride stiffened and his finger twitched closer to the trigger, forcing the tension higher. When it should have broken for a moment, the street seemed to hold its breath. The FBI badge gleamed in Simone's hand, every bit as real as the gun that Douglas Brinton gripped too tightly. He should have dropped it right, then should have stepped back and admitted he'd made a mistake, but pride is stubborn, and Douglas's pride was the kind that would rather burn down the house than admit he'd built it. Crooked, his hands trembled. The barrel twitched left, then right, like he couldn't decide where to land. Neighbors on both sides of the street clutched their children, some dragging them inside, others frozen, unable to look away. The air felt thick, stretched taut between the steady composure of Simone and the cracking bravado of Douglas. "You think that little badge scares me?" Douglas spat, his voice louder now, meant for the audience behind the curtains. "This is my neighborhood, not yours. You can flash shiny metal all you want. It doesn't mean you belong here." Simone's tone dropped to steel. "That badge means I've faced armed men in situations that make this look like a playground. It means I've stood between shooters and civilians, and I've walked out alive. You think you're in control, Douglas? But your hands are shaking. Everyone here can see it." Her words weren't just for him. They were for the witnesses, for every camera recording every whisper that would replay this night. She wanted the truth. Etched into the retelling, she had remained calm, measured, while he had lost control. A neighbor across the street, an older man in a flannel shirt, called out, "Doug, she showed you proof. Put the gun away before you do something you can't take back." But Douglas ignored him, his eyes locked back on Simone, burning with something deeper than suspicion, now anger at being exposed. "You think you can just walk in here, pull rank, and humiliate me in front of my own people?" He barked, his face flushed red. The weapon bobbed dangerously. Simone kept her stance, grounded, her voice even. "Nobody humiliated you. You did this to yourself. You pulled a gun on your neighbor, and now the truth is in the open. You can stop this before it gets worse." "Lower it, Douglas. That's your only way out." Her calmness was gasoline on his fire. He wanted fear, he wanted trembling tears, and admission of weakness he could use as proof that he was right to protect the neighborhood. Instead, he was being dissected in real time by someone who refused to bend the gun. Rose, slightly centering on her chest, gasps rippled through the block. A woman screamed, "Doug, don't you dare!" Simone's mind calculated options. If he fired, she was close enough to lunge, trained enough to redirect. But that risk wasn't just hers. The ricochet, the panic, the stampede of neighbors could turn this street into chaos. She needed to break his spiral without forcing his hand. She took a single step forward, slow and deliberate, her eyes locked on his. "Look at me. You're pointing that gun at someone who has trained men half your age to keep their composure under fire. You are out of your depth, and you know it." Douglas's breath hitched, his finger twitched on the trigger guard. One wrong word could have been the end. Simone lowered her voice almost to a whisper that still carried in the silence. "You want control, Douglas? Then prove you can control yourself right now. Show your neighbors you're not the danger here." The words landed harder than he expected. He blinked rapidly, sweat dripping into his eyes. His arms sagged a fraction. The crowd murmured again, sensing the shift for a split second. It looked like the weapon might finally lower, but pride clawed back. He snarled, "You don't get to lecture me. I built this committee. I keep this street safe when the cops don't bother showing up." Simone's voice sharpened, again cutting through his delusion. "Safe? You're aiming a loaded weapon at a federal agent in her own driveway. There's nothing safe about that. You're seconds away from prison or worse." Douglas's lips curled into a grimace. His teeth clenched so tight the veins in his neck bulged. He was unraveling, trapped between the truth he didn't want to face and the humiliation of backing down in front of an entire neighborhood. The silence was broken by a neighbor's panicked voice. "Someone's already called 911. The cops are on their way." Douglas's eyes darted, panic flashing for the first time, his grip loosened ever so slightly, but instead of lowering the weapon, he swung it back towards Simone, desperate to cling to control. Simone saw the mistake, the hesitation, the moment of weakness. She steadied her stance badge, still visible in her hand, and spoke with finality. You've crossed every line. And spoke with finality. Tonight, but you still have one choice left. Put that gun down and walk away with some dignity, or keep pointing it and lose everything you think you're protecting. The crowd was holding its breath again. Some whispered prayers, others muttered curses, but all eyes stayed fixed on the trembling figure of Zahn. Douglas Brinton, a man with too much ego and too little restraint, but before the choice could be forced from him, the wail of sirens cracked through the air, growing louder with every second, pulling the standoff into its most dangerous moment. Yet the sirens grew louder, slicing through the night, like a blade. Red and blue lights spilled across the houses, bouncing off windows and casting the street in sharp, pulsing colors. Neighbors shifted on their porches, some raising their phones higher, others ducking inside. Now that real authority was on its way, Douglas Brinton's face flickered between anger. His hands trembled more visibly now, the pistol wobbling like a pendulum. For the first time, he realized he was no longer in control of the stage. The cameras weren't his, the narrative wasn't his. Two squad cars screeched to a stop in front of the cul-de-sac, tires crunching on the asphalt. Four officers stepped out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Put the gun down, drop it now. For a split second, Douglas looked stunned, as if he couldn't comprehend that the orders were directed at him. He turned toward the flashing lights, gun still in hand. That single movement set off a ripple of panic across the street. Children screamed, someone shouted, "He's going to shoot," and the officers tensed, ready to fire. "Don't you dare point that at them," Simone cut in, her voice carrying over the chaos. Her tone wasn't desperate. It was commanding, sharp enough to slice through the noise. She turned slightly, lifting her badge higher so the officers could see it. FBI Tactical Command. The armed suspect is Douglas Brinton. I am a resident and federal agent. He has been threatening me with this weapon for several minutes. The word FBI hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the neighbors, some repeating it under their breath. The officers froze for half a second, their eyes darting between Simone's badge and Douglas's shaking pistol. Douglas's face twisted, caught between outrage and panic. "She's lying. She's making it up," he stammered. "That's not real. She doesn't live here. I know who belongs here doesn't live here. I know who belongs here. And she doesn't." One of the officers, a tall Dan with a steady voice, barked again. "Mr. Brinton, drop your weapon now. You are aiming a firearm at a federal agent and a homeowner. This is your final warning." The reality of the words finally seemed to hit him. He wasn't the protector anymore. He was the protector anymore. He was the armed suspect. The man cornered under flashing lights, surrounded by neighbors recording every twitch of his hands. His pride wrestled with fear, but pride dies slow. "I was doing my job," Douglas shouted, his voice cracking. "I was protecting this community. She doesn't belong here protecting them." Simone shot back, her tone laced with sharp disbelief. "You nearly pointed that gun at a child 2 doors down. You waved it at your own neighbor's wife. That isn't protection, that's reckless endangerment. You turned a quiet street into a potential crime scene because of your ego." Douglas's eyes darted to the porches. He wanted validation, some sign that the people he'd claimed to protect still stood with him. But the faces staring back weren't loyal. They were horrified. A woman whispered, "He almost killed her." Another muttered, "He's lost it." "Doug, just stop." A man across the street yelled, "This isn't safety, it's insanity. It's insanity." The officers moved closer, voices layered now. "Drop the gun. Put it on the ground." Douglas's arms wavered, his chest heaved, the weapon dipped, then rose again as if pulled by invisible strings of stubbornness. His pride still clung even as the walls closed and Simone locked eyes with him. Her words. Jasmine locked eyes with him. Her words. Deliberate. "Douglas, listen to me. You can go down as the man who admitted he was wrong and put the gun away, or as the man who pointed it at an FBI agent and was taken away in handcuffs, or worse. Is this really how you want your neighbors to remember you?" The choice lay bare in front of him, and the silence that followed was crushing. His grip shook violently. Now he looked like a man drowning, fighting against the water when all he had to do was let go finally. With a guttural sound that was half growl, half sob, Douglas lowered the pistol. It clattered against the driveway loud, and finally the officers surged forward, one kicking the gun aside while another grabbed his wrists and cuffed him. Douglas shouted as they pulled him back. "You're making a mistake. She doesn't belong here. She tricked all of you." His protests fell flat against the flashing lights and the heavy silence of neighbors who had seen too much. Simone exhaled slowly, the first real release of tension since the confrontation began. She tucked her badge back into her jacket, standing tall, not triumphant, but resolute. One of the officers approached her cautiously. "Ma'am, Agent." "You okay?" She nodded. "I'm fine, but you'll want the neighbors' statements. Plenty of cameras, too." The officer glanced toward the houses where lenses glimmered like watchful eyes. "Looks like half the block has it recorded." "Good," Simone said evenly. "Then nobody can twist the story," the crowd murmured louder now. No longer whispers, but open conversations. The tide had shifted. They weren't questioning her presence anymore. They were questioning why Douglas had been allowed to carry a weapon and patrol like a vigilante. But while Douglas was finally in cuffs, the real battle wasn't over, because the fallout from Lani this night was about to divide the entire neighborhood. The flashing lights didn't die down quickly. They multiplied within minutes. 2 more patrol cars rolled in, followed by a supervisor's SUV. The cul-de-sac was now a flood of red and blue, turning the quiet block into something that looked ripped. From a breaking news story, Douglas Brinton sat on the curb, wrists cuffed behind his back, his face contorted in outrage. His vest reflected the lights like a warning sign. No one wanted to see. He didn't stop yelling even as 2 officers flanked him. "This is wrong. You people don't understand. I was trained." "Protecting the neighborhood. She doesn't belong here. Enough, sir." An officer snapped, pressing him gently, but firmly down onto the curb. "You're done talking until we get your statement at the station." Douglas thrashed slightly, but the fight was gone from his arms. His anger now spilled out only in words. Wild and desperate. Meanwhile, Simone stood with her hands folded in front of her, posture straight, expression calm. On the surface, she was composed. Inside, her pulse was still catching up to the last 10 minutes. She knew how close she had been to violence, and she knew the story wasn't over. A sergeant approached her, flipping open a notepad. He was older, maybe late 40s, with lines etched around his eyes. His tone was professional but respectful. "Agent Kearns, can you walk me through exactly what happened here?" She nodded. "I pulled into my driveway. Mr. Brinton was blocking it when I identified myself as the homeowner. He accused me of trespassing. He drew his weapon, threatened me, and refused multiple commands to de-escalate. I displayed my credentials, and he continued to point the weapon until your units arrived." The sergeant scribbled notes, glancing up every few seconds. "And you've lived here how long? 2 years? How long? 3 months. I purchased Unit 314 in June. Titles in my name." The sergeant gave a slight nod. "All right. We'll confirm with the AHO records. But I believe you." He glanced at Douglas, who was still shouting toward the gathering crowd. "She's lying. She's making all this up." You'll see. One officer turned to Simone. "Ma'am, you did exactly what you should have done. Your restraint probably kept this from turning tragic." Simone gave a tight smile. "That's my job, unfortunately. Tonight, it followed me home around them." The neighbors were growing bolder. Now that the gun was out of Douglas's hands, the whispers had turned into debates. A woman in a gray sweatshirt muttered to her husband, "I always thought Doug was too extreme about this security thing." Another man, phone still in hand, shook his head. "Extreme? He nearly shot her. He waved that gun around. Did around. Like a toy." But there were dissenters too. One neighbor shouted from her porch, "Doug was just doing his job. We need someone looking out for us." "You don't know what kind of people move in here." The sergeant's head snapped toward the voice, but Simone spoke before he could. Her tone was level, but the steel said, "To steel hull." Underneath was undeniable. Someone looking out doesn't mean someone with a gun and no training. That's not security, that's intimidation. If you want safety, you need responsibility, not paranoia. The words hit the crowd, some nodding, some looking away in discomfort. The tension wasn't gone. It had shifted. Moving from Douglas's weapon to the larger question hanging over the neighborhood, one officer collected phones from a few neighbors who volunteered their recordings. Another started taking written statements. The sergeant turned to Simone again. "We'll log the weapon, run his permit, and notify the and notify the office. My guess is he's looking at assault with a deadly weapon, menacing. Maybe reckless endangerment, but I'll be honest with you, Agent. Some of these folks seem to think he was protecting them. It may get messy, Simone's expression. Didn't flinch messy doesn't change the facts. He aimed a loaded firearm at a federal officer who was standing in her own driveway. Every camera on this street has it the truth isn't negotiable. The sergeant gave a small grunt of agreement, snapping his notebook shut. We'll be in touch. In the meantime, I'd recommend locking your doors tonight. Some of your neighbors look like they're about ready to start a shouting match. He wasn't wrong. The voices were rising. A man with folded arms barked. He's not the villain here. He's the only one who cared about our safety. Another neighbor fired back. Cared? He pointed a gun at a mother in her own driveway. That's not caring. That's lunacy. Simone stayed silent, letting them argue she didn't need to win the crowd. The truth would speak for itself when the recording surfaced, but she couldn't help noticing the divide, the way people shifted into camps, some defending Douglas out of loyalty or fear, others finally relieved someone had called him out. The sergeant waved his officers toward the cars, signaling the end of the immediate response. Douglas was hauled up, cuffed wrists behind his back, still ranting. "You'll regret this. I kept this place safe." "You're all blind." The door of the cruiser slammed shut, cutting his voice into muffled noise. The neighbors lingered, divided, but restless. Approached Simone, hesitant, offering quiet words like, "Glad you're okay," or "I'm so sorry you went through that." Others glared from a distance, unwilling to shift their allegiance. But Simone knew the real storm wasn't the flashing lights. It was what would come after, when the D and the neighbors tried to reckon with what they had just witnessed. The patrol cars pulled away slowly, their lights still splashing across the cul-de-sac as Douglas Brinton sat in the back seat, cuffed and shouting until the car turned the corner and disappeared. The street fell into a strange stillness. No gun, no sirens, just neighbors standing in clumps processing what they had just lived through. Simone remained near her SUV, arms crossed, the badge still tucked inside her jacket. Her body was steady, but her mind was racing. The adrenaline that had carried her through the standoff began to drain, leaving behind that heavy, restless energy she'd felt countless times after dangerous encounters in the field. Only this wasn't a field operation. This was home. A neighbor approached it. Cautiously, a man in his 60s wearing pajama pants and slippers. He cleared his throat. "Agent Kearns, I didn't know you lived here." "You do now," Simone replied gently, softening her voice. He shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking to the driveway where Douglas had stood minutes earlier. "Doug's, well, he's always been loud at meetings, but none of us thought it would come to this." Simone tilted her head. "Didn't you? He wore a vest, carried a gun, patrolled like a sheriff, without a badge. Did no one question that the man hesitated? Then side people complained. Sure, but some liked having him around, made them warm. "Feel safer until tonight," Simone said, her tone even. The man nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. He mumbled a good night and shuffled back to his porch, leaving her with a faint smell of freshly cut grass and asphalt cooling in the summer night. A group of neighbors huddled near the corner. Voices low but heated, one woman snapped, "I told you old Doug was going too far. He nearly shot her." Another fired back, "He was trying to protect us. You don't know what it's like being a woman here alone at night." A third neighbor shook her head. "He pointed a gun at the wrong person and made us all look like fools." Simone heard every word, but she didn't intervene. She knew the battle for perception wasn't hers to fight. It would play out in HEO meetings and gossip threads, in the comments section of videos already being uploaded online. Still, not everyone avoided her. A younger neighbor, maybe mid-30s, walked up with his phone still in hand. "Agent Kearns, I recorded the whole thing. If you need it for your report, I'll send it over." "Appreciate it," Simone said, her eyes softening. "You may have just preserved the truth. For when it matters most." He gave a small nod and returned to his wife, who was clutching their toddler on the porch. Then came the ones who couldn't hold their tongues. A woman with folded arms and a pinched expression marched across the street. "You know, if you really lived here, people would have seen you around more. Doug had reason to be suspicious." Simone turned slowly, her posture still. "Composed, ma'am. I work 12-hour shifts for the FBI. I come home late, leave early, and spend my spare time with my daughter. I didn't realize visibility at barbecues was the litmus test for belonging." The woman's mouth opened, then closed. Her glare lingered a moment before she spun back toward her porch. Man nearby muttered, "She's right. Doug went way too far. Way too far." Simone thought the understatement lingered bitterly. He'd nearly turned her driveway into a crime scene. Finally, the street began to thin. Porch lights flicked off curtains, closed. The neighbors retreated, some whispering apologies. Others Simmering in quiet anger divided by loyalty and pride when the last patrol car pulled away, Simone was left standing in the wash of her own garage light. The night was still again, but the calm didn't settle. Her phone buzzed. A message from a colleague heard. "Ah, it happened, you good." She typed back, shaken but safe, sliding her phone into her pocket. She stared at the spot where Douglas had stood, his arms trembling, his finger flirting with the trigger for 20 years. She drilled agents on composure under fire tonight. That training had saved her life in her own driveway. She locked the SUV, stepped into her garage and pressed the button to close the door. The heavy rumble echoed louder than usual. She leaned against it for a moment, her breathing measured, then straightened. Tomorrow there would be reports, meetings, fallout, but tonight there was only the silence of a neighborhood trying to decide whether they just witnessed their protector exposed as a threat or their threat disguised as a protector. But Simone knew the question wouldn't end on the street. The Echo would have to face it head on, and the next meeting was already shaping up to be explosive. The emergency meeting was called Sudim, and it was called. Less than 48 hours later, word spread faster than wildfire. Emails blasted through inboxes, texts shot across group chats, and flyers were taped to mailboxes by a neighbor who apparently thought old-fashioned paper carried more weight by the time Simone walked into the E.A. Joey clubhouse that Thursday evening. The air was already thick with tension. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A makeshift conference set up with metal chairs arranged in uneven rows. The usual 20 or so residents had ballooned to more than 60 people stood along the back wall. Some with arms crossed, some with arms crossed, some with phones ready to record. At the front sat the board, 4 members looking pale and rattled, shifting papers and avoiding direct eye contact with the crowd. The chairwoman, a short woman in her 70s named Margaret Dwyer, tapped a gavel against the table with shaky authority. "Order. Please, let's get started." She started. She said. The chatter dimmed, but didn't vanish. Simone chose a seat near the middle, deliberately placing herself where every eye could see her, but without claiming the spotlight. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to witness. Still, she knew the room would pull her into it. The first speaker wasn't from Matsumaskan. The board, it was a man who leapt up before introductions were finished. Tommy Brandt, one of Douglas's staunch supporters. He waved a finger in the air. "Douglas Brinton was protecting us," he barked. "He's been the only one who ever cared enough to patrol at night, and now he's sitting in jail like a criminal while criminals walk free." "That's a disgrace." A few cheers rose from his side of the room. But just as quickly, a woman countered. "A disgrace. He nearly shot our neighbor. He pulled a gun on a federal agent in her own driveway." More voices erupted. "He didn't know she was FBI." Someone shouted. "That doesn't vigilantism." Matter. Another fired back. "She showed him she lived there, and he still pointed a gun." The gavel banged again. Margaret Dwyer raised her voice, straining against the noise. "Enough. We will not shout over one another like children. Each person will have their turn." The crowd simmered, but the tension sat heavy in the air. Finally, Margaret gestured towards Simone. "Agent Kearns, since this concerns you most directly, perhaps you should speak first." Every head swiveled. The attention didn't faze her. She rose slowly, smoothing the sleeve of her jacket, and stepped forward. Her voice carried across the room, even steady, but sharp enough to cut through murmurs. "I didn't want to be here under these circumstances. I moved into this community to build a safe home for my daughter and myself, but on Tuesday night, I was met not with safety, but with a neighbor pointing a loaded gun at me because he decided I didn't belong." That says. Silence deepened. "I've spent 20 years teaching federal agents how to de-escalate armed situations, but the fact that I had to use those skills in my own driveway is unacceptable. Safety doesn't come from untrained people carrying weapons and intimidating residents. It comes from trust, responsibility, and accountability." A man near the back scoffed. "Easy for you to say when you've got a badge." Simone's gaze flicked toward him, steady. "The badge didn't keep me alive Tuesday night. My composure did. And the only reason you're not watching a tragedy on the evening news is because I knew how to stop one angry man from making the worst mistake of his life." Murmurs swept through the crowd. Some nodded, others frowned, but no one spoke for a long moment. Then a woman rose slowly. Her voice wavered, but held strength. "I was one of the people who thought Douglas made us safer, but to Watching him wave that gun, I realized he wasn't protecting anyone. He was feeding his own need for control. We all saw it." The room shifted. Supporters of Douglas fidgeted, glancing around for backup. Opponents straightened, emboldened by her words. Margaret Dwyer tapped the gavel again. This board will be as to tap the gavel again. This board will be voting tonight on Mr. Brinton's removal from the Safety Committee. We will also be discussing a motion to ban armed patrols by private residents. Only licensed security or police will be authorized moving forward. That set off another wave of arguing. Some shouted about rights, others about common sense stunts. The board sat pale and overwhelmed, but the motion was already gaining traction. Simone let the chaos swirl around her. She wasn't here to win an argument. She was here to make sure truth didn't get buried under excuses. Finally, she raised her voice. One last time, you all have a choice to make. Do you want safety that's rooted in paranoia, or safety that's rooted in trust? Because what happened in my driveway could have been any of you or your children. The next time, there may not be someone trained enough to stop it. The words hit like a stone dropped into water, rippling through the room. The shouting, prodigious, quieted the weight of what she'd said, pulling everyone into silence. Margaret cleared her throat. The vote will proceed, but Simone knew the vote was just paperwork. The real decision would linger in every neighbor's mind, shaping how they saw one another from that night on. By the time Simone closed her front door that night, the echoes of the HOA meeting still clung to her ears. The arguments, the accusations, the desperate defenses of Douglas, all of it circled in her head, like voices refusing to die down. She tossed her keys into the ceramic dish by the entryway and leaned against the wall for a cruel moment, letting out a long breath. She hadn't realized she was holding. The house was quiet. Her daughter staying overnight with a friend. That silence was both a relief and a weight. For 20 years, she had walked into homes after dangerous assignments and managed to leave the tension at the door. Tonight, it followed her, and her phone buzzed a familiar name, lit up the screen. Agent Marcus Bellamy, an old colleague from her academy days. She answered, putting him on speaker as she moved into the kitchen. You holding up Simone? He asked, his voice low and steady, the tone of someone who already knew the answer. She grabbed a glass from the cabinet, filling it with water. I'm fine, she said, though the word carried less conviction than she intended. I've had men point guns at me before, Marcus, just not in my driveway. There was a pause, the kind where both people knew more was being said in the silence than in words deployed. You want to talk it out? He asked gently. Simone sat at the kitchen table, staring at the faint scratches in the wood from years of use. He looked at me like I was an intruder in my own life. Didn't matter that I had the garage remote in my hand. Didn't matter that I said my address. He already decided who I was the second he saw me. That's what sticks. That judgment. Bellamy's sigh came through the speaker. Pride and fear. Dangerous mix. You handled it the way only you could. You kept him from making the kind of mistake that ruins everything. Simone ran her fingers along the rim of the glass. I kept myself alive, sure, but I keep thinking, what if I hadn't been trained? What if it had been one of the other women on this street just coming home late from work? Would they be alive right now, or would we be planning a funeral while people called it a misunderstanding? Her voice cracked and slightly, the anger and exhaustion finally surfacing. You can't carry all of that, Bellamy said quietly. You did what you could. You saved yourself, and maybe you saved the next person by exposing him. Simone swallowed hard, her throat dry. I moved here for peace, for stability, for my daughter to grow up without looking over her shoulder every time she walked down the block, and instead the person claiming to protect the neighborhood nearly turned it into a crime scene. There was a long pause. Bellamy let her words breathe before replying. You've seen what real protection looks like, Simone. That's what Toady makes it hurt more when people confuse paranoia for safety. But don't forget, you showed them what calm authority really is. You taught that neighborhood a lesson none of them will forget. She gave a dry laugh, not from humor, but from disbelief. Yeah, lessons expensive, though. Now half of them don't know. Half of them don't know. And it was about the choice she made not to match his aggression with aggression of her own. On a quiet Saturday morning, Simone stood on her front porch with a mug of coffee, looking out at the street that had become the stage of a near tragedy. Children were riding bikes again. Lawns were being trimmed. Neighbors waved politely, though some waved with hesitation. She could feel the divide still pulsing beneath the surface, some grateful for her restraint. Others bitter that she had embarrassed the man they once trusted. Her daughter stepped outside, hair pulled back, eyes wide with the blunt curiosity. Only a teenager could carry. Mom, people at school are talking about you. Some of them saw the video. They can't believe you stayed calm with a gun in your face. Simone gave a small smile. Staying calm is what kept me alive. It's what kept me alive. It's what kept him from ruining his life, too. Her daughter frowned, but why do you... Even at the cost of someone else's dignity, step back. And when you think control means dominance, remember that true strength is restraint, because in the end, the real danger wasn't the gun Douglas Brinton carried. It was the fear and pride that made him pull it out. And the real protection wasn't the badge Simone Kearns carried. It was the judgment that told her when to raise her voice and when to hold her ground. That's the lesson this story leaves behind. If you've stayed with me until the end, don't just walk away with the shock of what happened. Walk away with the reminder that we all have choices. In the heat of the moment, choices that decide whether a situation ends in tragedy or in survival. And if you want more stories that remind us of these truths, stories that make us think about the world we live in and the choices we make sure to subscribe. Your attention helps keep these lessons alive, and maybe, just maybe, it'll help us all build communities that are safer, not because of fear, but because of wisdom, because safety isn't about who can shout the loudest or carry the biggest weapon. It's about who can keep their judgment steady when it matters most.